because in fact it was this extraordinarily moderate, cautious, and sensible address that was an important address. So that much of that was unreported. Just if there was any attention to it at all, it was in the ways that I'm suggesting. Now, Qaradawi as a figure is important in that he does represent a school of centrist, moderate Islamists. And they have been working for decades, and they have produced, and I discuss them in my book Islam Without Fear, they have produced a body of really quite incredible literature on basically the big issue, Islam, can it address the needs of the modern world? And can the legacy be rethought and made relevant in today's time? A really wonderful slogan that they have. The slogan is one eye on the texts and the other eye on the contemporary realities, the context. And their work is to bring the text and context together. So they really have produced this extraordinary literature. And it's not just the one individual. That's what makes the work so important. It's a school of thinkers. And on all the key issues, things we're interested in, the role of non-Muslims, the role of women, issues of democracy, human rights. There's extensive literature on all of those things. And they are important as part of a centrist network of Islamist figures. There are connections, for example, to the Tunisian. You see, we focus on the networks, on the extremist networks. But there are moderate networks as well. So, for example, just one example, when Qaradawi was a major scholar, just absolutely prolific scholar. You know, in the Sunni hierarchy, there is no hierarchy. So, to establish yourself as a scholar, it is the work that one does. So it's his intellect, it's his writings, it's his speaking that is, and he did a program on Al Jazeera for years and years. So he got a kind of a very wide, following throughout the Middle East. But the point I want to make is that these scholars, first of all, the Qaradawi himself is not isolated. This is not just one isolated. This is part of a school, and it's a systematic thinkers of centrist Islamic thinking. They came out of the Muslim Brothers. They're no longer in the Muslim, but they came out of the Muslim Brothers and produced this incredible body of literature. Now, when I was working on it, people were saying, Raymond, what are you doing? These are moderate, these are minor figures. They're off to the side. It was striking to me that in the events in Egypt, the Arab uprising, when the Islamic figures, the important ones, it was the new Islamists that played the role. It was Qaradawi they turned to. When the Egyptians were interested in a commission to, revise the constitution, it was someone called Tariq al-Bishri, who was another member of the school, who headed that commission on a whole host of controversial issues when young people were looking for Salim al-Awa, who's yet another. So these figures are important. We don't know them in the West. We don't pay attention to them. We don't read them. We're busy with some of them out in the world for obvious reasons. But maybe the reasons are not so obvious. These are marginal figures. Here we're talking about a mainstream. And it's not just a mainstream in Egypt. It does go beyond. So for example, Qaradawi's most recent book is on jihad, the concept of jihad. And what does it mean in Islam? What is its genealogy? What are its references? And it's this huge multi-volume work. I read it last summer. It's one of my poor research assistants. So I dragged him through this. He's a secular guy too, so it's an extraordinary text. And who reviewed it? Ranushi from Tunisia did one of the major reviews. Who are they interested in? They're interested in the Turks. They talk about the Turks. Is the Turkish example, is it relevant to Cairo or not? That's one of their great debates. Of course they say, no, it isn't. They're Turks, we're Egyptians. We know how the Egyptians are. This is the center of the universe. But nevertheless, can we be instructed by that experience? Absolutely. So they pay very close attention to it. So, none of that registers here in this country. And what we have is instead the faces, the Khomeinis, some of them values, and the fears that they generate. So these people are, but the point is, they're not wiped out in the Middle East. The young people know. If you look at some of the important young writers, like Bilal Fadl, who speak for the new generation, these are the sort of hipper types. When they talk about Islam, they go to these people. So they are really present. I just want to make the point that that address by Paladar really had great importance, and it was largely unreported. Now that's not true of Obama's address, 2009. That address got, obviously, for obvious reasons, a kind of global attention. So I want to turn to that address as a kind of marker. You remember it. This was, remember he was shopping, where am I going to go? Is it going to be Tunisia? Should I go to Turkey? Should I go to Cairo? And of course, made the only sane and rational choice. He went to Cairo. And that was the place he wanted to speak. And even though he had clause doing things, even though Turkey was kind of rising power, he chose Cairo. And I think it was a wise choice. So he used the platform of Cairo University to deliver the address. We usually use the singular when we talk about the speech. This was his opening to the Islamic world, and it's still credited in that way. But this was his speech. When you actually read the text of the speech, or if you're there when the speech is being delivered, it wasn't one speech, it was two. And the first speech really was quite remarkable. He had very good help and counsel in doing that speech. When Westerners quote the Quran, they usually screw up. They mess it up. It's the wrong quotation in the wrong place, and it doesn't quite make sense. This was perfect. I would say it was breathtaking. If you wondered why the response was so, it was because he had somebody gave him a command of the resources. It was, and he said the right things about Islam, the things that need to be said. And just how extraordinary this religious tradition is, just how exemplary it is as a cultural tradition, just how important it has been for humankind and the advances of humankind. Where would we be without the medicine, the astronomy, the experimental science, what we have is not So he said all of those things. And that was the first part of the address. And you remember the other president had given a speech in another site until they took their shoe off and threw it. No shoes. No shoes coming through the air. Instead, we heard from the balcony a cry of a young voice, Obama, we love you. And that was pretty much the sentiment for that part of the speech. What's typically not remarked on is there was a second speech. And it was strikingly different. And this was a speech in which Obama turned from the, evaluation of Islam, which he did extraordinarily well, to the issues of policy. And what was amazing about that speech is that it could have been delivered by George W. Bush. No problem at all. Neither Cheney nor Bush would have had any problem with that speech. It was all continuity. And, so sort of from the warm mist generated by that first speech, then you get this cold shower of the second. All of the essentials of American policy are in place. The war on terror is there, the special relationship with Israel is there, the self-understandings of Americans. We're getting it again with Obama. The gentle giant, we're walking through the area. Us interested in oil? Absolutely not. We just linger a little longer in places that have oil, but we're not really interested. And we've always got with us this little companion, small, vulnerable, tragic history, and so only wants to defend and just for the good of the region. This is this great myth of the U.S. and its Israeli ally. In the Middle East, Obama retold it yet again. So we know that. We saw it first, right? In terms of the continuity in the two critical areas, the financial appointments and the military security. Essential. So this was very clear. And so when people talk about the speech, I think it's important to hear both speeches. And the first one, with all the focus, and that did represent a breakthrough. But the second, and this is the important thing that people were listening for, they wanted some signal of a change in policies. Some new vision, some kind of rethinking. And the essential point is that there was absolutely no. It's total continuity. What was upsetting about the speech and the narrative was the sort of the underlying narrative. You know how we like to say in politics, narrative is everything. What was most upsetting was the whole promise of a new beginning, of rethinking, of reformulation. It was lost. There was no space in that speech for any of that. There were isolated breakthroughs. For example, speak about the Palestinians in a slightly different way, talk about bits and pieces. But the essential narrative was the same. And there was no indicator, no opening even for a rethinking of these policies. I want to make a transition from that speech, very important speech, and pay a little bit more textual attention to it, to the new speech. This is the March 28th address, in which Obama, again, should we be surprised that he backed this kind of military action? No. The continuity was there. And I think also this, when you paid attention, and probably many in the room, it's a recent speech, and we heard him deliver. You paid attention to it, there were some really extraordinary dimensions of that speech. One of them was the way in which the Iraqi story is told. I can say that. The Iraqi story is really quite extraordinary, as recounted in that March 28th speech. As you know, we talk about Iraq, and we talk about Petraeus, and we talk about the surge, and we talk about success. All of that was in the speech. So we did say, I'm not going down that road. But if you look at the actual text, it says, I'm not going down that road of regime change as we did in Iraq because we can't afford it. That's what he says. We don't have the resources for it. So if we could, the assumption is, we should. Also, when he talks about Iraq, he talks about the lives lost in Iraq. And there's this beauty, this is a little bit sensitive, it's a little bit hard to say this. I actually, I was thinking, can I really say this? But I think we need to say it. There's a sentence in the speech in which he says, and this is when he's saying we're not going down that road. He says, look, it cost us, we lost thousands of American and Iraqi lives. In one phrase. Look, there's a moral dimension to proportionality. We had, 4,000 young Americans. This is absolutely a tragedy, without question. But can we really say American and Iraqi lives when we're talking about hundreds of thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably a million Iraqi casualties? Can we really do that? I think the answer is no, we can't. And then finally, from the speech, again, another quotation, he says, Iraqis have their country back. And you can almost see the gestures. He didn't mention the country is broken. He didn't mention that this Iraqi success, what it cost, what conditions, these deplorable, horrendous conditions in Iraq, the horrors that Iraqis lived through in the wake of that invasion. It's all being washed out of our histories under this sort of rubric of success. This is again the gentle giant, well-intentioned. We intended to do well. We stumbled there. We sacrificed 4,000 lives. It's all being retold. And the actual, the realities on the ground are simply appalling. I just came back from a conference in Brussels, just outside of Brussels. And it was this extraordinary, I've never attended anything like it. It was 200 people, approximately. And they were primarily Iraqi exiles and Iraqis from Iraq, and then international specialists, who have some connection or interest or scholarship on Iraq. And what was extraordinary about it, I had never been in a conference with so many people weeping. I'm serious. I'm sitting in a panel. First, this guy is crying, and then this guy is crying. And they didn't start out weeping. I mean, they started out, doing a presentation that was going to be on, I don't know, museums or artifacts, and what happened, Iraqis are simply so traumatized. And how